So Bethesda is planning to support Starfield with more DLCs and expansions than they have with previous Bethesda titles. And we've actually gotten a decent bit of information on what we could expect with these future DLCs, so I want to go over all the information I could find on future DLCs and content. And if you're enjoying my Starfield coverage, make sure to subscribe. This channel is solely based on Starfield, and we have tons of videos coming soon. Now, I think one of the biggest differences when comparing DLC from previous Bethesda titles to future DLC of Starfield is the philosophy change within Bethesda. Because Todd Howard has mentioned this in multiple interviews that because of how long of a life Skyrim has had, they now want to support their games for much longer periods of time. Because if you go back to Skyrim or Fallout 4, there actually wasn't a lot of new content added into the games as DLC, especially for how long both of those games have been continued to be played by massive amounts of people. The majority of Skyrim's support has been re-releasing the game and adding in small bits of content with those re-releases. But from looking at a bunch of small teases and information from multiple Bethesda developers, it seems that they are going to be going about DLC for Starfield in a completely different way and continuing to update it and add new content for much longer periods of time. Now, a good place to start is the DLC that's already been announced for Starfield, which is called Shattered Space, and they're calling this the first story expansion to Starfield. Now, them calling it an expansion makes me think it's going to be a pretty substantial addition of content into the game. It's obviously going to be much more focused around the story they're trying to tell in that DLC and less focus on adding new features into the game. And you can actually already get this if you pre-order the higher tier versions of the game. And the two theories I've seen based around this DLC is at first it could be the reignition of the colony wars, which were wars that took place between the United Colonies and the Freestar Collective that took place 20 years before the time period of the actual game of Starfield. And that could potentially be a really cool concept, a massive galaxy spanning war between these two factions, and you would choose between one of the two to take part in the war. Or a lot of people have also been saying it may be something based around a black hole, because Todd Howard was specifically asked about black holes and he basically said no comment, and it would kind of fit in with the name. Now, in some of these interviews, Todd Howard has also mentioned them wanting to add in new features and systems into Starfield as additional DLCs or expansions, so further expanding on some of the big systems that we already have, such as shipbuilding or outpost building, or adding in completely new features. He talked about this as the developers having things that they want to do in Starfield that they want to add into the game, and also kind of mentioning that some of the stuff may have been things they wanted to do for the original release, but they had to cut it to actually be able to release the game. So there could be systems or features that were already partially built that they want to add in as DLC, or just stuff completely new that they've been thinking about. Now, this concept of new features or systems was also talked about in an interview with Jamie Mallory, which is a producer on Starfield, and they asked her if she had a favorite project she's worked on, and she mentioned the shipbuilder in Starfield. And she said, "We had an amazing team with some developers who worked on the incredible snap maps in Dune 2016, and we've got this massive list of exciting features we're looking forward to discussing and potentially implementing in the future. I can't spill all the details here, just think about the possibilities gets my dopamine pumping." So we've now had multiple mentions of new systems and features that the team on Starfield is excited to implement further down the road. So now we already know we're getting a story expansion, which we could probably expect to get more of further down the road for Starfield. And we've had multiple interviews with multiple people on the Starfield team saying that the different teams are very excited to add some of the new features and systems that they've been working on further down the road for the game. And I think when looking at a lot of these comments and how Starfield is actually being developed, there is just going to be a massive amount of potential for additional content. And when just looking at the new systems or features side, there's a massive amount of possibilities. You could expand the outpost system into being able to build your own space stations. You could expand the shipbuilding system into creating your own ground vehicles, or as I went over in a previous video, allowing us to create our own mechs that we would pilot around on the surface of planets. You could expand on the faction systems. You could massively expand on weapon modding and crafting. Starfield just has so many really big systems, that expanding upon those is going to be massive. And then with a sci-fi game, you have just infinite possibilities on new systems. But then one of the most exciting parts about looking at future Starfield content is the potential scope of these DLC. Now, Starfield is obviously going to be a ridiculously massive game on launch, but Starfield is also going to have over 1,000 planets, only around 10% of those having any life on them, but then having these 900 other planets that are basically going to be barren, but still are going to have a ton of resources on them. And I've also seen this theory thrown around that a future DLC could legitimately add a bunch of life on some of these planets. Now, there's a couple ways they could go about this. They could have something happen to a planet where now there's life that was naturally evolved on that planet, so a new planet has life on it that's not intelligent. But I think something that may be a lot more interesting is some new faction, or maybe even existing faction, kind of taking over one of the empty planets. So maybe some new faction sprouts up and they take over, say, an entire planet and make that their home world. They could make these new cities, they could start building infrastructure, and they could basically just try to retrofit their own planet for this one faction. That would be pretty exciting in itself, but then you also have previous factions that may try to take over whole planets, or even just have big excursions into some of these empty planets. I could very much see a future DLC being based around the big corporations in the games, such as Ryujin Industries or the Xenofresh Corporation, and they just start to build a bunch of factories or try to take over some planet because there's some super valuable resource on it, and then you have a big DLC based around that. Maybe you're going there to help that corporation, or maybe you're going there to fight back against that corporation. There's just a massive amount of possibilities when just looking at how many empty planets there's going to be. And then there's one final DLC concept that I think is more exciting than all of the others, and that's the introduction of intelligent aliens. Now, we don't know if there's going to be any actual intelligent aliens in Starfield. It seems like there's not going to be, even though the main story is being somewhat based upon ancient alien civilizations, but they probably still wouldn't exist, at least within the Starfield on launch. But it would be pretty incredible for a future DLC or an expansion to have this intelligent alien race arrive within the galaxy or within the playable space of Starfield. You could have this new alien race arrive in their massive ships, and maybe the DLC starts as you're part of the party that's going to make first contact with them. Maybe they take over full planets. Maybe it starts a war with humanity and they're trying to exterminate humanity. Maybe they're somewhat peaceful, and maybe they're like kind of a new faction you can join with a big story based around learning about this alien species, where they come from, learning all their new technology and maybe even their new language. And this would probably be a much bigger expansion, but if we are a few years down the road, this is something I very much want to see over basically anything else. And all this is just on the official side of Bethesda. We're obviously going to have just so many mod makers and mods being created for the game, which on the player side, a lot of these mods are essentially going to be looked at as DLC. A lot of people are just going to play them as new content. There's a lot of pretty big teams making Bethesda mods, so a lot of these mods are also going to be decently well polished, add a ton of new content. Obviously, years down the road, there's going to be some big overhauls that people are going to be producing. So on the mod side, there's just going to be almost infinite amount of possibilities. And I know there's already tons of mod developers and mod teams pretty excited to get working on Starfield when it's released. But even just on the official side of Bethesda DLC, I think they're going to be creating and releasing more post-launch content for Starfield than they've done for basically any of their previous titles. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.